Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to have you all back again for our second installation of The Christmas Story in Art with Dr. Ian Boxall. It's a delight to have you with us again, and I will not take any further time in introductions, as most of you were here last week, and allow you to get right into it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Father Sean. So last time, those of you who were here will remember that we looked at three witnesses, or three groups of witnesses to the Nativity. One not explicit in the Gospels, that was the prophet Ezekiel, but that's because of a particular image in the National Gallery. This one, in fact. And then we looked at the Magi as witnesses and the shepherds as witnesses. Well, today I want to focus particularly on Matthew and think about the subsequent story, or what we might call the aftermath of the Nativity, which is a complex and in some ways troubling aftermath. Christmas is not only about chestnuts roasting on an open fire and Santa Claus and tinsel and Frosty the Snowman. There is a darker side to it which Matthew presents to us in his story of what happened after the Magi returned. And I just want to flag up three things before we look at that story and then look at some of the ways in which artists have visualized that story. The first is, and this really goes for the whole of the infancy story, the nativity story, the prefiguring of the nativity story in both Matthew and in Luke, the story is told not so much to focus primarily on what happened. Lots of other things happened. But what those events, as they are told by the evangelist, tell us about who Jesus is. So there's a lot of focus on identity. The second thing is that identity is often conveyed to us by reminding us of older stories that we might otherwise have forgotten. And of course, Matthew's first readers, or Matthew's first audiences, knew the Old Testament far better than I do. So they pick up on things that I hardly am capable of hearing. And in particular, Matthew is picking up on one major story and one major figure. The major story is the story of God's people, Israel. Go back to the later chapters of Genesis, and at a particular point in the early formation of what will become the people of Israel, Jacob, has to go down to Egypt as a consequence of a famine. Joseph, his son, happens to be in Egypt, you know the story, and so we hear of Israel, Jacob, and his family with him, so the incipient people of Israel going down to Egypt. And then, a good while later, we hear about that people coming up out of Egypt with Moses. So that story is in the background of the story that Matthew tells about what happened to Jesus after his birth. And the figure of Moses is also very important for understanding who Jesus is. Moses, hidden from a wicked king in Egypt who wanted to destroy the male Israelites. Jesus, rescued from a wicked king who is intent on destroying the male children. That is Herod. So the relationship between Pharaoh and Herod, Jesus and Moses, is being played out. The third point I want to make is not so much about looking back, but looking forward. the story that Matthew tells us is not only looking backwards, it's also foreshadowing what is going to happen to the adult Jesus. Hence, that darker element. What should be a happy Christmas story? Hints of threat, hints of danger, hints of death. The slaughter of the innocents, the intent of Herod not to worship the child Jesus but to destroy the child Jesus. In other words, the story of the Passion is already being flagged up in the story of Jesus' birth. Okay, now let's move into the story of the flight. I'm very quickly going to read the story for us, remind us of the very truncated story that Matthew tells us, and then think about how that opens up questions, how it's full of gaps that are just crying out to be filled by our imaginations. When they had withdrawn, that's the Magi, they'd been warned in a dream to go back to their own country by a different way. When they had withdrawn, look, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, saying, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. And be there until I tell you, for Herod is about to seek the child to destroy him. So he got up, took the child and his mother by night, and withdrew into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, in order that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt have I called my son. So it's not only going down, it's actually coming up out of Egypt, which is fulfilling the scriptures, fulfilling a quotation from the prophet Hosea, which originally referred to Israel coming up out of Egypt at the Exodus. One of the titles of Israel in the Old Testament is God's Son. In the past, God brought his son Israel out from Egypt with Moses at the Exodus, and now he is bringing his son Jesus, who relives the experience of the people of Israel out of Egypt in a new Exodus, which will not simply liberate God's people from slavery, but will liberate God's people from the slavery of sin. Okay, so that old story being told in order to describe this new thing that God is to do in Jesus, the one who temporarily is rescued but ultimately will have to face his fate in Jerusalem. But I said, it's a very truncated story, and it raises all kinds of questions that Matthew doesn't answer for us. How long did it take them to get to Egypt? Which route did they take? Did they go due south, or did they veer off to the coast through Gaza and then down that way? Why was Egypt the chosen destination? What memory would God's people have of Egypt? Is it only the Exodus, or are there other memories which would make sense of why Egypt is the chosen destination? And it's an interesting feature of the subsequent history of the Jewish people that in times of threat, Egypt has often been a place of security and safety. King Jeroboam goes to Egypt. The prophet Jeremiah goes to Egypt. And here's a real irony. King Herod at one point went to Egypt. And now the one who is escaping Herod also goes down to Egypt. So Egypt is not only associated with slavery and the Exodus, Egypt is also associated with a place of safety for God's people when the Holy Land is not a place of safety. What mode of transport did they have? Did they walk? I guess most of us imagine a donkey coming in at some stage into this story. Did they stop along the way? Because it's a very, very long journey. And when they get to Egypt, how long did they stay in Egypt? How long was it before their arrival and the death of Herod, which allowed them to return? So the gospel story provokes all kinds of questions which are calling out for imaginative filling in, imaginative answering, in order to say even more about the significance of this story. Okay, here's our first image from the National Gallery, Carpaccio's The Flight into Egypt. Venetian artist, the landscape is not dissimilar to the Veneto, the territory close by to Venice. This is in many ways contemporized, although there is an archaic dress for Mary and Joseph and the infant Jesus. And yet, you think about the reason why they go. They're told to flee. There's danger. They're escaping danger and potential death. Whereas Carpaccio has given us not so much the flight into Egypt as the leisurely trot into Egypt. So is he tapping into another dimension of the story, which is divine providence, the preservation, the protection which is provided for Jesus and the Holy Family on this journey? So the immediate threat is out of the way. They've slowed down and they're making a fairly leisurely progress from Bethlehem down to Egypt. I'll say the terrain is very recognizable as northern Italy, and yet I want to draw attention to this mountain. Now, it's possible that one might imagine this mountain as one of the Dolomites. But there's another possibility that Carpaccio is reminding us of that more ancient story in which one particular mountain played a significant role. That is Mount Sinai. So again, this is a new Exodus which is being played out here. And the story of Moses, the story of the Israelites, is there somewhere in the background. The other thing to notice about this image is what Joseph is doing. Now, the donkey seems very determined to keep to the road. It's a well-trained donkey. Joseph is veering off the path onto this rather lush green plot of land here, which is very reminiscent of the way in which the Garden of Eden is presented in late medieval and particularly Renaissance painting. So, is there something about the effects of the story of this child, that paradise is about to be restored, which is being played out in Carpaccio's leisurely trot down to Egypt? Okay, did they rest on the way? Well, they must have rested on the way, but Matthew is not interested in the journey itself. He's more interested in the destination and what that means. But Christians like to know these things. And so it's not long before Christian texts start to fill in the gaps. We talked last time about the proto-gospel of James, the 2nd century apocryphal gospel, which tells us about what happened prior even to the birth of Mary, and embellishes some of the events surrounding the nativity. there's a later text, probably from around about 7th, 8th century, called the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. So it has some overlap with Matthew, but it is not by Matthew himself, which fleshes out what is happening on the journey. And this becomes a very popular scene in Northern European, particularly Flemish art in this period. And the story goes something like this. They rest because they're tired. Mary particularly is tired. Mary is also hungry. And they sit under this palm tree. It's a very high palm tree, and Mary looks up and she sees these rather luscious dates. But they're far, far out of reach, even for Joseph. By this time, of course, the miracles of Jesus' ministry are already being anticipated in the story of his childhood. So, the infant Jesus is very alert. He is also quite capable of commanding this fig tree, because he is the fig tree's creator, to bend down. So you have this story in which the fig tree bends down so that Mary can take some of the dates. Joseph, meanwhile, is more worried about the fact that they've run out of water, and so Jesus, again, creator of the fig tree, commands the fig tree to issue forth water from its roots so that the Holy Family can be watered as well as fed. Now this is a 14th century English representation of that. You see the fig tree bending down, you see Joseph ready to collect the water. This is from the Hope and Picture Bible of 14th century. Okay. Not quite the same as what's happening in Gerard David's Rest on the Flight into Egypt. First of all, Joseph is waving the stick around, and it's not a palm tree. You don't get many palm trees in Belgium and the Netherlands. You do, however, get chestnut trees. So the story has been reworked for a Northern European setting. And the focus now on Joseph, a shift from the focus on divine protection to now human protection. Joseph now has a much more important role by this stage as the provider of the Holy Family. Okay, God has provided the chestnuts, but Joseph is the one who has to provide them directly for the Holy Family. So he's kind of bashing around with that. Meanwhile, Jesus has already supplied a bunch of grapes, so he can feed his mother. So the miraculous Jesus is still there, but somewhat overshadowed by Joseph. And of course, there may be a symbol of the Eucharist here, the grape symbolizing the Eucharist. So the Eucharistic provision for God's people is already being foreshadowed. There's also here, very difficult to make out, the beginnings of a spring of water from beneath the tree, picking up on that motif in the story. Incidentally, if you could look more closely, you would see that Joseph is no longer elderly. Joseph is young and virile. He is the energetic provider of the Holy Family, which is why you often see him in visual art with a saucepan. He's doing the cooking. He's provided the food and he prepares it as well. Okay, back to the story itself, more recognizable, although there's no mention to the mode of transport in Matthew's Gospel, but it's just as it's fairly soon envisaged that there were animals at the Nativity, because Jesus is placed in a manger, so too it becomes imagined that a donkey was used to enable the Holy Family to get down to Egypt, which then invites new parallels between different scenes in the Gospel which are not possible simply on the basis of the Gospel text. If you have a donkey and you have a journey which becomes a fairly triumphal journey of the child Jesus to Egypt, where Egypt is converted. Egypt is a place where idols are worshipped. And in these apocryphal texts, when the infant Christ comes to Egypt, the Lord comes to Egypt, then the idols are destroyed and the Egyptians come to believe. The flight into Egypt is a very important motif for the Coptic Orthodox Church. But once you have a donkey, then you begin to see parallels being drawn explicitly to later in the Gospel. Another kind of foreshadowing, in this particular case, the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So Giotto, in his famous frescoes in Padua, has deliberately connected these two scenes, one from the beginning of Jesus' story and the other from the beginning of the end of Jesus' story. Who else was with them? Was it just three of them? Or were there other family members? You see that already in Giotto, and you see it, let's go back to Giotto actually, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, there are boys and girls, sometimes the midwives, but they're often not identified. In some Eastern traditions, they are identified, as in this modern icon of the Nativity. A bit difficult to see here, but down the side it says Hagios Jakobos, St. James. Now, there's a division pretty much east and west over the identity of the brothers of Jesus referred to in the Gospels. The east goes with the second century proto-Gospel of James, that Joseph had been married before, is an elderly, reluctant suitor for Mary, and so therefore he already has a family. So the brothers of Jesus are the family of Joseph. The West tends to prefer that they are cousins. Brothers used in a looser sense. But here the Eastern tradition is very clear. James, the brother of the Lord, is an older brother, and he accompanies the Holy Family down to Egypt.
Recognizing you're a biblical scholar, not a theologian, how does the West reconcile that proto-gospel? Because it does want to draw from it in terms of Joachim and Anna.
Yeah.
But I remember that from last week where
Yeah.
I talked about that, and his most chaste spouse, as
Yeah.
we like to say at benediction, would not really go with the proto-gospel of James. So does the West try to
Well, I mean, the
interpret that?
the kind of motif you get of Joseph as lifelong celibate comes quite late in Western medieval thought.
Right.
Although it kind of picks up on. So Jerome discusses, I mean, you do get hints of it in Jerome, because Jerome is very keen on celibacy and virginity. He doesn't have the most optimistic view of marriage, Jerome. So you do get hints of that there, but it becomes much more prominent relatively late in kind of Western thought. But Jerome discusses kind of three accounts of the brothers of Jesus. One is that they're his love brothers, his natural brothers, later offspring of Mary and Joseph. One that they are Joseph's offspring from a previous marriage, and the other that they are, which the West tends to go with, even though it likes the proto-gospel of James in some ways, is that they're cousins.
But no one interprets until modern Protestantism as being later siblings.
So yes, Helvidius does it. So Jerome writes a response to Helvidius.
Ah.
Yeah, in the 4th century. So you do. So yes, you do get that. But actually, it's the Reformers basically accept the medieval view. Luther, Calvin, etc.
Right.
And then it's kind of later on that
I'm thinking of Protestants today.
But there is an ancient antecedent Jerome responds to. Yeah. So you've got these 3 options. Here, the Eastern view that this is an older brother.
So Joseph is carrying the baby as the baby's
Yeah.
leg, holding the
Yeah.
baby.
So he's piggyback.
That's unusual
Mm-hmm.
for Joseph
That
to
is,
carry
yes.
the baby.
Which is giving more prominence to Joseph, which actually takes a while to develop.
I brought a nativity scene from Cameroon in West Africa and gave it to a collector of crushes. And it had Joseph holding the baby. And the collector said it was the first one she had ever seen.
Yeah, of course.
So that's that
this is a modern
perspective.
icon. But that'd be an interesting thing to trace, to see. I mean, people like St. Bernard and then Jean Gerson, who taught at the University of Paris, later Middle Ages, they give particular prominence to Joseph. He gets a new lease of life, really, in the 2nd millennium, having been very much the elderly figure in the background for much of the first millennium. The other image, 2 other images of the flight before we move on to the other side of the story. Henry Lassalle-Tanner's The Flight into Egypt from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Very interesting. I'm just beginning to learn about his work. He was an African-American artist from Pittsburgh, brought up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And one of the things he seems to be exploring in his flight into Egypt is, the way in which that flight is, in some sense, actualized in the migration of African Americans from the south to the north. So as artists have often done it, they're seeing parallels between this flight and migration of particular groups and populations throughout history. He's particularly picking up on that. So you have much more of a sense of, the note of threat for the Holy Family. This is under cover of darkness. This is by night, which Matthew does emphasize. Joseph gets up, takes the child and his mother by night and flees into Egypt. The final image, which is very unusual, I want to briefly show you because it spans the connection, makes the connection between what immediately follows this in Matthew's narrative, which is the slaughter of the innocents. This is an image, and it's clearly the flight into Egypt by the English Pre-Raphaelite William Holman Hunt, perhaps most famous for his Light of the World in various versions. He actually did 2 versions of this, at least. One is in Tate Britain in London, the other is in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. But the Holy Family are now accompanied by the souls of the martyred children of Bethlehem. So that they're just kind of waking up on this side, and they're becoming more and more robust. This one here is kind of noticing there's a little tear in his garment, and what had been a wound, a sword wound, but it's been healed, transformed, and they become more and more robust. So are they moving from kind of disembodied souls into resurrected bodies as they move on? There's a little bubble here which has a reflection in it of the Garden of Eden. So I'm only beginning to try and work out what's happening in this painting. I'd like to know more about what's going on. In fact, Holman Hunt did actually write about this painting, what he was trying to do. But it's connecting these two stories, which Matthew also connects by a sandwiching technique. So he has the flight into Egypt. He then has the slaughter of the innocents, which is the consequence of Herod's desire to kill Jesus, and then we have the return from Egypt. So these two are interwoven in the narrative, but very rarely interwoven in the visual tradition. Here's an example of where they are. This is a German woodcut from the National Gallery, where the flight is happening here, and then the slaughter of the innocents is happening here, and it is giving particular prominence to King Herod, who is overseeing both of these things, which seems to me to be tapping into a particular problem that the gospel story raises. Have any of you ever been troubled by the massacre of the innocents? I hope you have. Of course, it's a very troubling, horrifying event. But for some people, it has, of course, raised the theological question: if God could protect his son, why could he not have protected these young babies of Bethlehem? And you see in different ways how theologians and artists are grappling with this problem. What are you going to emphasize in the story? How are you going to understand what's going on? One is to shift the focus from God to the human actor who is determined to bring about mass slaughter. That is Herod himself. And so the prominence of Herod, he overshadows even the Holy Family. You tell the significance of a character by their size, and the focus there is over the role of Herod, which of course is also picked up in some of those medieval mystery plays, which have fed into some of the carols that we sing at Christmas, like the Coventry Carol. Lule, lule, thou little tiny child. Go and look again at what that says about Herod, sung by the mothers of the children of Bethlehem. Again, it's emphasizing the human responsibility of what happens. Or alternatively, you see the innocents as prefiguring the passion of Christ himself, and therefore becoming the first Christian martyrs. Ask yourself the question, who's the first Christian martyr? Stephen? Okay, yeah. John the Baptist? The Holy Innocents? The church hasn't quite worked this out. We tend to think of Stephen, and we talk about Stephen as the proto-martyr, and yet we also have this feast of the Holy Innocents. And we also have this feast of the beheading of John the Baptist. And so this motif of the martyrs prefiguring what is happening to Christ, in some sense sharing in his passion in anticipation, is a common motif. So here you see the rather gruesome massacre in Giotto. Now in medieval theology, martyrdom was seen as a kind of baptism. So even if you weren't actually baptized, you could be baptized by blood. Now notice this building in the background. Giotto's contemporaries would recognize that as a baptistry. So there's baptism happening here and there's baptism happening there as these martyrs are being baptized in their own lives. Or alternatively, in this contemporary Eastern Byzantine icon, you have the souls of the martyred innocents, in a sense, overseeing what is happening to the Holy Family. From a heavenly perspective, they're not simply seeing what's happening on earth, but what that really means and what that is pointing towards. In fact, they're even seeing their own deaths happening upon the earth. So this kind of apocalyptic, heavenly insight into what is happening upon earth, viewed from the perspective of the martyrs. Indeed, in some Eastern traditions, there are a huge number of martyrs. I mean, some even say there are 144,000 martyrs in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was not big enough to, it may have just been a handful of children. But in the book of Revelation, the number of the martyrs is 144,000. And so you can see how that is being played out in this theology of martyrdom.
I think also an important point too that's different between those is in the East, they don't have the Augustinian view of original sin.
Mm-hmm.
So there wouldn't. So in the West, the sense of baptism by blood would be important for the innocents. But in the East, it's just not important. They would immediately go to heaven.
Yeah. But you do also get in Eastern liturgical traditions this concept of the martyrs.
Yeah.
And hence it's particularly in some Oriental Orthodox churches that 144 or 144,000 comes into play. So without doctrine of original sin in that Augustinian sense, they're still seeing their particular role as martyrs, prefiguring what's happening to Christ. Now, when I first saw this, it's quite a famous painting. I thought, what a nice Christmas card scene. Till you start looking more closely, and then you start noticing this group of soldiers. And then people going about their business, not paying much attention to these soldiers, chatting, doing the shopping, walking the dog. And then in the middle you begin to make out raised swords and anguished mothers and babies being cradled. And this rather tranquil Netherlandish scene becomes a scene of tragedy and trauma. And then Bruegel's contemporaries would recognize the armour that these soldiers are wearing. The Netherlands in this time was under the control of Spain, and the soldiers here are either identifiable as the ruling Spaniards or they're German mercenaries. Herod is alive and well in the Netherlands in the 16th century. The identification of new Herods across the centuries is something which is a recurring motif. The violence of Bethlehem did not stop with Herod. It continues to this day. The final scene I want to show you is a Poussin. It's now in London, the Dulwich Picture Gallery, entitled Le Retour d'Égypte, The Return from Egypt. That's what it's currently called. It used to be called The Flight into Egypt. People can't quite make up their minds whether this is the beginning of the journey or the end of the journey. Current thinking it's the end of the journey. But in terms of this way in which Matthew foreshadows the passion of Jesus in the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, I think Poussin has conveyed that in a very dramatic way. Look at the expression on the face of the child Jesus. He sees a heavenly vision of the cross. he sees the passion that he will have to undergo. Mary ponders, as she is wont to do. Joseph doesn't look up. Joseph, no indication that anyone else can see this angelic vision of the cross. Joseph instead looks back at the donkey. And of course he sees what donkeys have on their back.
The mark of the cross.
The mark of the cross. Ever seen a donkey without a cross on its back? He sees in the donkey a foreshadowing of the cross. Meanwhile, there's a ferryman who is about to take them across the river. Old Testament texts and Greek and Roman mythology often feed together into the interpretation of Christian events. Charon, the ferryman, ferrying the dead across the river Styx. The passion of Christ, the death of Christ is dominating this representation of the return from Egypt. He returns in order that he may preach the gospel of the kingdom, in order that he may go to Jerusalem, in order that he may suffer, die, be raised, in order that he may save his people from their sins. Which seems to me is the basic message of the gospel according to Matthew, writ large, on one canvas, in a little picture gallery in South London.
Is that a reference to Jerusalem, this golden, these buildings in the background?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think that's Egypt because there's what do we call those things? Like the Washington Monument.
Obelisk.
There's an obelisk there.
Okay. I
So
can't see the
it
detail.
looked, you have to get up close to see it. So it looked like Egypt, but then Egypt being illuminated by the presence of Christ. If this is a return, then he's already been to Egypt, and that translation has already begun. Okay.